40,000 Soviet soldiers died in Afghanistan. Over 500,000 came home broken. The last commander to cross the bridge out of Afghanistan wept in front of his men. He did not try to hide it. He knew what the bridge meant. Not the end of a war, the end of something larger. The Soviet army had entered Afghanistan in December of 1979 with more tanks than the Germans had used to invade France. It left 10 years later having accomplished nothing it had gone in to do. It lost an entire generation of young men in a country most of them had never heard of. And when those men came home, the ones who came home, they found a country that could not look them in the eye. The Soviet Union had sent them into Afghanistan. The Soviet Union did not want to hear what had happened there. The story of what happened there is the story of how an empire talked itself into a war it could not win. It is the story of the soldiers who fought it. It is the story of what they came home to. And it is the story of a decision made in Washington that followed them home without ever using their names. To understand the Soviet decision to invade Afghanistan, you have to understand the Soviet Union in 1979. It was an empire at the height of its formal power and the beginning of its hidden decline. Its nuclear arsenal was the equal of America's. Its army was the largest conventional force on Earth. It had just agreed to the second round of strategic arms limitation talks with the United States. On paper, it looked like a superpower in full command of itself. Behind the paper, something was crumbling. The economy was stagnating in ways that the official statistics could not obscure for much longer. The leadership was aging and increasingly disconnected from the country they governed. Leonid Brezhnev, who had led the Soviet Union since 1964, was 72 years old and visibly declining. The men around him were not significantly younger. They were a gerontocracy making decisions about a country they no longer understood. Afghanistan sat on the Soviet Union's southern border. It had been a Soviet client state since 1978, when a communist coup brought a Marxist government to power in Kabul. That government was tearing itself apart. Factionalism, purges, and brutal mismanagement had produced a rural insurgency that threatened to overthrow it entirely. Moscow had a choice. Let Afghanistan fall to an Islamist insurgency on its own border, adjacent to Muslim-majority Soviet republics, or intervene to stabilize the situation. The men in the Politburo chose intervention. They believed it would take a few months. Somewhere in a barracks outside Moscow, a 19-year-old conscript named Volkov was reading a letter from his mother when his unit received deployment orders. He had been in the army for 4 months. He did not know where Afghanistan was. He folded the letter. He put it in his breast pocket. He would carry it for the next 2 years. The bridge at Termez, spanning the Amu Darya River on the Soviet-Afghan border, would be the last piece of Soviet soil he stood on for a very long time. He crossed it on the 4th of January, 1980. He did not look back. The Soviet force that entered Afghanistan was enormous. By the end of December 1979, approximately 80,000 troops had crossed the border. The number would eventually grow to 110,000 at the peak of the deployment. The strategy, such as it was, assumed that Soviet military presence would stabilize the government, suppress the insurgency, and allow a managed withdrawal within 12 to 18 months. This assumption collapsed on contact with the geography. Afghanistan was not a country that rewarded conventional military operations. It was a collection of mountains, valleys, and desert plateaus connected by roads that barely deserved the name. The Hindu Kush Range covered the northeastern half of the country. Passes through it reached 4,000 meters above sea level. Tanks could not use them. Helicopters could barely function at that altitude. The Soviet army had been designed and trained for a large-scale conventional war in the plains of Central Europe. It had been designed to fight the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, not guerrillas in mountain passes, not fighters who could vanish into villages and reappear 20 kilometers away the following week. The Mujahideen, the Afghan resistance fighters, were not a unified force. They were a constellation of groups, often hostile to each other, united primarily by their opposition to the Soviet occupation and the government it was propping up. They were poorly equipped in the early years. They had light weapons, captured Soviet rifles, and intimate knowledge of terrain that their enemies would spend a decade studying from maps. The first major Soviet operation in the Panjshir Valley in 1980 illustrated the problem precisely. The valley was controlled by Ahmad Shah Massoud, a young military commander who had studied engineering before the war and who applied engineering logic to guerrilla tactics. He did not hold ground. He yielded ground, drew the Soviets into the valley, cut their supply lines from the ridgelines above, and forced them back. The Soviets launched 9 separate major operations in the Panjshir. Massoud held the valley for the entire length of the war. Here is the thing about fighting in a place that does not want you. The ground itself becomes the enemy. Every road is a potential ambush. Every village is an intelligence problem you cannot solve. Every mountain pass is a position that the other side knows better than you do. The Soviet soldiers sent to fight this war were not cowards. Many of them were capable and brave. What they lacked was a mission that made sense. And without a mission that made sense, bravery has a very short shelf life. The early years of the war produced a pattern that would not change for a decade. Soviet forces would clear a region of Mujahideen fighters. They would leave to reinforce another operation. The fighters would return. This was not a failure of tactics. It was a failure of strategic logic. Counterinsurgency requires not just clearing an area but holding it and providing an alternative to the insurgency. The Soviet force was large enough to fight but not large enough to occupy. It could win every battle and lose the war. It was doing exactly that. The Afghan government the Soviets were propping up was not helping. It was actively making things worse. The People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan was as factionalized as it had been before the Soviet intervention. Its security services ran a terror campaign against the rural population that drove farmers and villagers directly into the arms of the Mujahideen. Every person the government tortured became a fighter. Every family the government destroyed became 5 fighters. The Soviet military understood this. Its own reports described the Afghan government as a source of instability rather than stability. Those reports went to Moscow. Moscow continued to support the Afghan government. The logic was circular and inescapable. The Soviets could not withdraw and leave their client to collapse. They could not stay without sustaining a war they could not win. They were trapped by the decision they had already made. But here is the part of this story that changed everything beyond Afghanistan's borders. And it is the part that most Western accounts of this war treat as a footnote rather than the main event. In 1980, the Carter administration made a decision. It decided to make Afghanistan the Soviet Union's Vietnam. The program was run through Pakistan's intelligence service and was the largest covert operation in the history of the Central Intelligence Agency. Money flowed in, weapons flowed in, training flowed in. Stinger anti-aircraft missiles arrived in 1986 and ended Soviet air superiority overnight. Between 1980 and 1989, the United States spent approximately $3 billion funding the Afghan resistance. Saudi Arabia matched that figure. Pakistan's intelligence service distributed it. The Mujahideen groups that received the most support were not, in many cases, the most moderate. They were the most effective fighters. The program did not ask what would happen to Afghanistan after the Soviets left. That question was not part of the planning. It would take 12 years to answer itself. By 1984, the war had settled into something that the soldiers on the ground recognized clearly even as Moscow refused to acknowledge it. A stalemate. Not a temporary one, a permanent one. The Mujahideen could not destroy the Soviet force. The Soviet force could not destroy the Mujahideen. What remained was the grinding daily reality of a war with no visible end. Soviet soldiers rotated through Afghanistan on 2-year deployments. They came from every corner of a vast country. They arrived expecting a quick tour in a minor operation. They found something else. The roads were mined. The convoys were ambushed at predictable intervals. The helicopter crews flew missions in conditions that their training had not prepared them for. The infantry lived in fortified positions that were supplied by convoys that were regularly hit. The summer heat in the lowlands reached 50 degrees. The winter in the mountains was brutal in ways that tested equipment designed for the European plane. The war produced its own internal culture. Soviet soldiers traded weapons for drugs with the same Mujahideen they were fighting. Heroin was widely available. The rate of addiction among Soviet troops in Afghanistan was significant enough to alarm the military's own medical service. Volkov had been at his posting in Kandahar province for 14 months by the summer of 1981. He had stopped reading his mother's letters carefully. He read them enough to know she was alive. He stopped reading the parts where she described the village and the things he had left behind. That detail would surface later in the account he gave a journalist who would not publish it for 20 years. He said he could not afford to remember what he had left. Remember the bridge at Termez from the beginning of this story. For 110,000 Soviet soldiers, that bridge was the last thing they had seen of home. Not one of them had been told the truth about what was on the other side. A civilization is not destroyed by its enemies. It is destroyed by the gap between what it tells its soldiers they are fighting for and what those soldiers find when they get there. The Soviet army told its men they were performing a fraternal duty. What they found was a war they were not allowed to call a war, in a country that did not want them, for objectives that changed every 2 years. The gap between the story and the reality was where the Soviet Union quietly began to die. The year 1986 marked a turning point that changed the military equation irreversibly. The first Stinger anti-aircraft missiles were delivered to Mujahideen fighters that summer. Before the Stinger, Soviet helicopter gunships had operated with a kind of tactical freedom that partially compensated for their other disadvantages. After the Stinger, that freedom was gone. Soviet pilots who had flown aggressive low-level assault missions learned to fly differently, higher, more cautiously, with less precision. The change in tactics reduced the helicopter's effectiveness dramatically. The Mujahideen now had a weapon they could carry on one shoulder that could destroy a machine worth millions. The psychological impact was as significant as the tactical one. The Soviet soldier on the ground had always at least had air support. Now that support was less certain. Now the sky above them was contested in a new way. In the summer of 1987, a column of Soviet vehicles was moving through a mountain pass in Kunar province on a resupply mission. The officer commanding the column was a captain named Nikolai Vorobiev, 29 years old, on his second tour. He had done this route 12 times. He knew the ambush points. He had radioed ahead. He had received confirmation that the pass was clear. The pass was not clear. The lead vehicle was hit at 11 in the morning. The column halted. The ridgelines above opened fire simultaneously. Vorobiev radioed for air support. The helicopters arrived 11 minutes later and flew at altitude. They could not get low enough to engage with precision. They fired. Some of the fire landed short. The fight lasted 3 hours. Vorobiev pulled his surviving vehicles out through a drainage ditch on the road's western side. He reached the next garrison at 4 in the afternoon. He sat down outside the command post. He did not go inside for 40 minutes. No one asked him why. Everyone who had been there long enough understood. There are moments in a war when a person has to sit very still for a while before they can be a soldier again. That was one of those moments. By 1988, the decision to withdraw had already been made. Mikhail Gorbachev had come to power in 1985 and had understood within months what the Politburo had refused to acknowledge for 9 years. The war could not be won. The word he used internally was bleeding. Afghanistan was bleeding the Soviet Union, not only in soldiers and money, in something harder to quantify and more important to a state's survival: legitimacy. The Geneva Accords, signed in April of 1988, set the timetable. Soviet forces would withdraw in 2 phases over 9 months. The last units would cross the bridge at Termez on the 15th of February 1989. The withdrawal was orderly. It was also covered in something that no one wanted to name directly. The soldiers who came out of Afghanistan were called Afgantsy, the Afghan veterans. They came home to a country that had officially not acknowledged the war was happening for most of its duration. Soviet citizens had known young men were going to Afghanistan. They had known young men were dying there. They had not been told the numbers. They had not been told the objectives were failing. They had not been told almost anything true. The Afghansy came home knowing everything. They came home into a country that had been kept from knowing anything. The disconnect between what the veterans knew and what the society around them had been allowed to know was not merely uncomfortable. It was explosive. Volkov crossed the bridge at Termez on the morning of the 12th of February, 1989. 3 days before the last official Soviet unit, he had been in Afghanistan for 2 years. He stood on the Soviet side of the bridge and looked back. He took out the letter from his mother. It had been in his breast pocket for 2 years. He had not opened it since the 4th month of his deployment. The crease had split the paper along the fold lines. He opened it carefully. He read it. Then he folded it again and put it in his coat pocket. He walked to the truck that would take him to the processing station. He did not speak on the ride. No one did. The Soviet Union's last soldier crossed the bridge at Termez on February the 15th of 1989. General Boris Gromov commanded the final withdrawal column. He crossed the bridge on foot. He stopped in the middle of the bridge and turned to face the camera that had been sent to record the moment. Then he kept walking. He told a journalist afterward that he had not wept because he was sad. He had wept because he was certain, in that moment, that everything his generation had been told about what the Soviet Union was had been untrue. The war had cost 40,000 lives, officially. The real number, most historians now agree, was higher. The injured physically, neurologically, psychologically numbered over 500,000. The economic cost across the decade has been estimated at between 20 and 50 billion rubles. That money was never available for the other crises the Soviet economy was accumulating through the 1980s. The Afghansy who came home were not welcomed as heroes. They were processed through military bureaucracies and discharged into an economy that was visibly failing. Some received apartments. Some did not. Their service was officially acknowledged but not celebrated. To celebrate it would have been to acknowledge what it had cost. To acknowledge what it had cost would have been to acknowledge why. And why led directly to the men who had made the decision in 1979. Those men were dead by 1989. But their decision was still alive. It was alive in the veterans who came home unable to sleep. It was alive in the anger that had no permitted outlet. It was alive in the groups of Afghansy who gathered in parks and apartments and eventually in political organizations and began saying out loud what they had not been allowed to say anywhere else, that it had been wrong, that they had been lied to, that the country they had been sent to defend was not the country they had believed it to be. Somewhere in a city in central Russia, Volkov joined one of those groups. He did not become a politician or a public voice. He worked in a factory. He went to the meetings. He listened to the other men talk. He did not speak often. When he did, the others went quiet. He had been there longer than most of them. He had seen more. He was the grief the room could not quite say. Soviet-Afghan war ended without a treaty, without a ceremony, without a victory speech. It ended with a general walking across a bridge alone. Within 2 years, the government that had sent those soldiers to Afghanistan no longer existed. The Afghansy came home into the beginning of the end. Gorbachev's glasnost policy had loosened the restrictions on public speech. The Afghansy filled that space immediately. Their testimony in newspapers, in memoirs, in photographs that had not been permitted during the war, produced something the Soviet leadership had not anticipated. Not sympathy for the war, fury about it. The combination of economic stagnation, political inertia, and the moral reckoning that the Afghansy forced onto the public debate was not the only cause of the Soviet Union's collapse, but it was a significant accelerant. The Soviet state had built its legitimacy on the claim that it served the interests of its people. The Afghan veterans were the evidence that it had not. They were walking, visible, impossible to ignore evidence. Not in the streets carrying signs, just in their faces, in the way they sat at dinner tables, in the things they did not say when their children asked them about the war. The Soviet Union dissolved on the 25th of December, 1991. 2 years and 10 months after the last soldier crossed the bridge. The Afghansy had been right about what the bridge meant. Not the end of a war, the end of something larger. What the Mujahideen could not defeat in 10 years of fighting, the veterans accomplished simply by coming home and telling the truth. That is not a comfortable ending. The Mujahideen, who received the weapons and training and $3 billion from the United States and Saudi Arabia, did not become stable partners when the Soviets left. Some of them became the Taliban. Some of them became Al-Qaeda. The weapons that had been used to bleed the Soviet Union out of Afghanistan were still in the country on the 11th of September, 2001. The program that had been designed to give the Soviet Union its Vietnam had given the United States its Afghanistan. Nobody in the planning rooms of 1980 had thought that far ahead. They had won the battle they were playing. They had not asked what game they were actually in. The soldiers of both sides did not get to answer that question. They got to live in the consequences, the ones who lived. If you want to understand what happened when the United States entered Afghanistan in 2001 with the same mountains, the same passes, and some of the same fighters, that story is coming to this channel. Subscribe so you do not miss it. Every week, this channel finds the version of the story that the official accounts left out.